Yeah, it's been a pretty long time, and I apologize for that. My life's been a little chaotic lately, and just had to take care of some business, but here I am, back to you with part 1 of chapter 15 of the Veil Riders. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 15. Fino's fingers shook a little as he spliced together two wires, completing the circuit for the massive daisy chain of explosives that wrapped around the entire munitions building. Yule had cleared the way to the building in the manner that humans were known for, with extreme prejudice. After being cut away from the execution pole, Fino was too full of fury to say no to the prospect of revenge for his fallen sister. But it quickly became clear to him that the human thought he was female, remarking that she would be happy to see her sister getting back at her murderers, referring to his dead sister being happy to see her sister getting revenge. Fino had seen in reports that they, or at least Yule, was more lenient to female prisoners, and he was not going to risk popping his little bubble of mercy. Now that they were both inside of the ammo depot, Fino wasn't so sure just how long that secret was going to last. He really had to pee, and frankly, Yule almost scared it out of him every time the human looked his direction. Between the strain of remembering how the plastic explosives worked, watching Yule dismantle elves, and trying to hold in his bladder, Fino was being stretched thin beyond belief. He poked his eyes over the top of the massive stack of Mac propellant bags and watched Yule, finishing off the daisy chain. From atop another stack of propellant bags, Yule was finishing off his 5th healing potion, swishing the reddish liquid in his mouth before swallowing and popping the cork back into the empty bottle. He rolled his shoulders and sighed, his entire body itching and burning as if a million fire ants were busily knitting his body back together. The bone repairing was the worst of it, and it reminded him of the time he was bitten by a black widow spider, except this time it was the bone expanding and growing instead of the toxin attacking his flesh. Using the pocket mirror taken off of a dead elf, he inspected his face. From the top of his left eye and down to around the middle of his right jaw, the huge scar was like a crack in a marble statue, running along his face in a thick line. He poked at the ugly thing and grimaced, noticing that while the raw flesh was healing, the scar itself wasn't going away, something that Yule hoped would happen. He looked at himself from a few angles while knitting his brows together, bared his teeth slightly in a snarl, then snapped the pocket mirror shut before tossing it into the corner of the depot. Fino saw him wing the mirror across the building and duck slightly, eyes flicking from Yule to where the mirror landed, and slowly brought his head back up. He made sure to keep his tone as obviously feminine as possible. I think it looks quite dashing as far as scars go. A pretty lie for an ugly man, Yule growled, and scooted down off of the propellant stacks, stretching his muscles to make the ants stop biting him so much. So, Miss Fino, are we ready to go? Fino did a small spin to check his wire work and found it to be sufficient. Having been assigned to an artillery unit, he had to study all kinds of weird materials on the subject, including how to work with the strange clay explosives that were sent in from the other side of the veil. The books had been a pretty fun read, and Fino snapped up any literature on the subject he could get his hands on after working through the English language. His sister always told him he was better off reading about the radio magics, like she was, but he found the circuit board layouts to be a bore, and the English associated with it gave him headaches. That, and when in comparison to the concussive blast of a C4 snowman, radios just couldn't keep up. This should be more than enough to take out this building and the other 6 buildings around it. The blast bubble alone should detonate anything within range. Yule formed his mouth into a muggish smile, something that made Fino confused as she had never seen such an expression before, and watched as Yule pulled out a small hunk of chalk. Want to make it personal? Always more fun. More personal? Fino asked, and blinked a few times. Watch and learn, Elfling. Yule said with a mirthful grin, and Fino had to guess he was feeling better after downing so many health potions. He watched Yule scribble in chalk on the wooden floorboards, mouthing the words as he saw them form. I cast explosion? Fino murmured, while Yule gave a wry chuckle and finished the sentence with a heart. Here, your turn. Yule handed Fino the bit of chalk. Fino racked his mind for something that was in the same category. Obviously, there was no need to write out his entire feelings or an epitaph, since this place would just be dust here in a few minutes, but something funny did come to mind. He remembered one book on improvised explosives had some kind of symbol written on random pages, and thought it to be some kind of symbol that humans of the same mindset used, something called the Marine. A kind of rallying icon like how the Veil Riders had that weird-looking unicorn. Fino stuck his tongue out a little and began to draw just below Yule's writings, and after a few minutes had finished it, tossing the piece of chalk triumphantly onto a random stack of propellant. Yule was looking down at the symbol, arms crossed and brows raised, having watched the entire thing get drawn from start to finish. Even as Fino turned to look at the human, Yule was still staring down at the phallic symbol drawn on the floorboards. Not gonna lie, Fino, not what I imagined you to put there, Yule said, pulling a hand from his crossed arms and holding it up, palm open. But I dare say you did an excellent job on the execution, spray, splurts and all. Looks like something you'd see doodled on a Marine bunker wall. Fino beamed at Yule and held out his hands towards the spurting dick symbol. Yes, I saw this in a book that was marked all over by them and their sayings. It was everywhere, and I thought it must be some kind of brotherhood icon of those who work with explosives, yes? Yule blinked a few times, then looked down at Fino, who looked way too happy and proud of himself, and Yule couldn't find the heart to tell him. Yep, nail right on the head there, Fino. Mind you, it's not a very ladylike symbol, and you should avoid drawing it on anything you own. Fino squinted a bit at the ladylike comment, but quickly remembered to keep his ace still up his sleeve. Ah, right. I'll be sure to keep that in mind. What do you want to set the timer for? Yule watched him pick up some kind of electrical timer and he shook his head. Nah, we're going to do this manually. Grab those wires and their spools. We're heading outside. Manually? Fino questioned, but gathered the 2 wire spools that were connected to the dizzying number of blasting caps that were plugged into bricks of C4 all over the room. Oh yeah, Yule murmured, and poked his head out of the rear door of the building, looking out at a long firing line of M109A7 paladins and a small cluster of elves standing watch. Yule's grin expanded along his broken face, and the glimmer of bloodlust crackled the life in his eyes once again. Inside the paladin, Yule drummed a finger on the loading ramp of the gun, the other finger scrolling along the screen of a tablet song collection. The tablet had been left inside of the artillery vehicle, and Yule had a mighty need for some theme music. Thrilling heroics always need a catchy tune behind them to really bring the scene together, after all. Fino was looking a bit green around the gills, and Yule leaned his head back to look at the elf, who was sitting beside a spare battery they had found and dangling his boots out of the rear hatch. You doing okay, ma'am? Fino looked out onto the dozen bodies laying around the paladin, still holding the 2 spools of wire in his hands. I have to pee. Well, make it quick. We gotta scoot. Fino ducked and stood up from the rear access door of the M109A7, walking around the side out of view. It was the 3rd time he almost pissed himself watching Yule work, and witnessing Yule choke the last remaining female elf to death almost made him trickle into his boots. Fino opened his fly and let loose his bladder onto the little bit of remaining grass, exhaling in relief, and his free hand began to shake. How easy could that human kill him? Were humans honestly that much stronger than elves? The last elf, a sergeant, had shoulder-checked Yule in the gut after he had broken the spine of a male elf private, ramming him face first into the ground, but the human didn't even budge. Yule just scooped her up with contempt, and the both of them whirled to the ground, Yule's arms swimming around her neck like a pair of thick snakes. Fino had been hiding behind a dividing sandbag wall and watched it all, the spools of wire rattling in his hands, and he couldn't help but watch in awe. The sergeant's boots kicked and scrabbled in the loose sandy earth as she was able to rip an arm free and claw at Yule's face, but Yule just bit down on it and continued to apply his chokehold. Fino watched her face turn red, the panic roll across her eyes, and the manic struggle as she tried to get free of his arms. She snorted and choked, trying to speak, trying to reason with the human, but Yule's face was set, looking down at the side of her profile, simply waiting. Her struggles became sluggish, her breath rasping, until soon she didn't struggle at all. Fino had watched Yule spit out the blood that had collected in his mouth, dust himself off, and walk off towards the paladin as if he had done nothing but move some furniture around a room. Fino gave his dick a few shakes before tucking it back inside his pants fly and rebuttoning it, turning around to go back inside the paladin. If he hadn't been dragged out and tied to the post, would he have fallen victim to Yule? Would Yule have run him down like he had the other elves? Fino's mind began to whirl about what it would feel like, what it would look like as Yule hunted him, tackling him down and choking the life out of him just so he wouldn't make a sound. His knee wobbled weakly as he went to crawl back inside the gunnery compartment, and Yule was plugging an auxiliary cord from the tablet into a small stereo, at which a bizarre song began to play at full volume. Madonna? Fino yelled over the full volume of the music, gathering the two ends of wire and poising them over the vehicle battery. Yule flashed him a wolfish grin. She's a classic. Wait for a good moment to touch the battery. A catchy lyric, maybe. Fino stared at Yule in horror as the human ducked out of the firing compartment and sprinted to the driver hatch. The bass from the radio was deep, the volume at max, which caused it to echo painfully around Fino's ears. He wouldn't kill me for setting it off at a bad lyric, right? Fino thought, but then looked out into the dozen dead and broken bodies laying around the little hangout and rest area. Right. Wait for the gangster bit in this song. Fino nodded and tossed out the spools while holding the active ends of the wires he needed to touch the battery. With the roar of the Detroit diesel engine, Yule wasted no time and slammed the paladin forward, roaring up and over the small sand wall in front of the artillery vehicle. Fino's screeching almost fell out of the back of the rear door, starfishing himself to catch any edge he could, both of the wires clutched in his hands. Fino bounced up and down, slamming bodily on the gun deck as the paladin rolled and roared ahead. Meanwhile, the music flared up around him. Down below in the comments section, press the timed link. Fino shook his head and squeaked as he began to slide across the gun deck towards the ammo storage, Yule putting the paladin into a hard sliding turn. Fino could even hear Yule laughing above the music, and a trickle of blood was tickling down the side of his face. Fino scrabbled towards the door and caught the battery before it too fell out of the gunnery compartment and hugged it to his knees, sitting up slightly and watching the spools. They were full spools, but he couldn't see them anymore, and reckoned he had maybe a few more feet of wire before he ran the risk of lacking slack. Fino was, however, unsure of just how tough this wire was, and quietly wondered if he should have double-checked the blast caps and make sure he hadn't jerked them out by accident. He couldn't help it, but he smiled at the absurdity of it all as the song continued to play around him, the vehicle jittering and bouncing wildly. This plan was beyond stupid, insane even. Yule was trusting all of this on a battery they didn't even bother to test. Click the second link in the comment section. Fino shook his head and held up both the wires, holding them above the battery terminals. That will do, Fino said flatly, and touched the wires down onto the terminals. For a split moment, Fino was afraid that something had gone wrong. There were 2 heartbeats of time before he saw the flash in the windows of the ammo depot. As the battery bounced out from under Fino and fell out onto the rushing ground below, he fell down onto his chest and elbows, still watching out into the chaos he had wrought. He had only read about such explosions, the massive detonations fabled to level entire towns and be heard miles away. But to see one in the flesh was something to behold. The buildings seemed to disappear in the bright pulse, replaced by a roaring impact of a god itself that shook the very air. A great curling pillar of smoke reached up into the sky, and the air itself was pushed away in a wide expansion, as if the explosion had blown a massive bubble. The bubble coursed through the town, and like a titan puffing out a breath, blew away the buildings and toppled them over, throwing wood and stone as if they were but shreds of paper before a fan. From the pillar of smoke, flame curled and rolled up into the sky like the burning heart of the explosion, boiling up higher and higher and feeding on whatever it could. That flame curled and lit up Fino's eyes, as well as the white teeth of his smile. The moment was pierced by the arrival of the shockwave, and they were still close enough that it lifted Fino up and shoved him back towards the gun breech of the vehicle. Fino slid to a stop and thumped against the wall, smile still proudly on his face and ears ringing with the tones of success. "Awesome," Fino murmured, as the music continued to play in the background and Yule whistled happily from the driver's seat of the Paladin. Overall, Yule was happy with their progress. His muscles felt better, he exploded the ammo dump and probably ruined that city, got revenge for his platoons, and found a little informant that had a grudge against his enemy. The performance of the Paladin was pretty good too. Luckily, they kept the thing stocked full of fuel and had a few fuel cans strapped to the side of it. After driving about 50 miles, he pulled the Paladin to a stop and left it idling, hopping out and checking in on Fino. Poking his head inside the gunnery area, he saw the elf sitting in a small seat and drinking a canteen of water. Yule gave Fino a thumbs up, which Fino returned, and then returned to the driver's seat and set back off at full speed. Fino was confused to feel the vehicle lurch back into motion, but just shrugged and took that moment to shut the rear hatch door and scramble back to his seat. For the next hour, not much happened or was said. Both Fino and Yule caught up in their own thoughts as they traversed the road back towards Emil Norris. Fino was more worried about the moment when Yule would find out he wasn't a girl. There were no records of male prisoners being taken, and if that was the case, Fino had to think up of information that would make him valuable. As the chassis rocked back and forth, Fino scribbled down in a little notepad all the things he knew, and after 20 minutes quickly realized he didn't know much of anything besides how to operate the damn machine he was riding in. "Ah, shit," Fino groaned, and he leaned back against the hull wall beside him. Despair was beginning to grip Fino, and he almost missed a buzzing, tinny sound coming from a small shelf. He saw it was a headset and pursed his lips, reaching out and grabbing it. The closer he brought it to his face, the more he recognized that someone was yelling over it. The Paladin also did a hard left turn and began to pick up speed, almost throwing Fino from his chair. "What in Cringe's clothes drawer?" Fino swore, and quickly clamped the headset over his ears. "Load it! Load the fucking cannon, Fino!" "What?" Fino yelled, and quickly pulled himself up to open the turret hatch. As he popped his head out, bullets sang and whizzed by, causing him to screech again and duck down behind the M240 Bravo mounted on top of the pintle. He poked his head back up and saw that, ahead of him, a massive firefight was erupting between two forces. One trying to hold the top of a tree-lined hill, and the other trying to surge across an open valley and onto the hill. "Fino!" Yule bellowed again, and Fino jerked in surprise, ducking back down as a long stream of machine gun fire skittered across the machine gun and hatch lid. I'm here, Fino called out, and got back down into the gunnery deck, looking around in a panic as the deck rolled under his feet as if he were on a ship. "Fino, my men are on that hill. Load that fucking cannon." "Yule, a paladin can't fire on the move. We have to unlock the gun, ask the digital gremlin for a firing vec." "Load the gun, I'll point it, you fire. Do it." Fino almost asked, "Or what?" before he remembered that Yule strangled elves to death with his bare hands, then jumped up and began pressing buttons on the command pad. The shell ramp kept rattling violently as Fino struggled with a round from the ready rack, but managed to get the shell onto the skid without tripping and crushing himself with it. Fino was just glad the loading ramp and plunger were working while on the move after fiddling with it for a few minutes, and it rotated out of the way after he jumped over it and pressed a button on the control panel. His boots squeaked on the gun deck as the paladin went over a bump, the propellant bundle twirling out of his hands and thunking down onto the gun deck. Fino scrambled after it, scooped it up, smashed the side of his head on a wheel handle, then tossed it into the breech. He pressed up on the breech release and it closed, then smashed the other side of his head against a toggle box. The elf tasted blood in his mouth, but pulled the primer out of the bandolier that swung wildly back and forth with the movements of the rumbling paladin. The worst part of this entire process was getting the primer into its slot and in the correct position, the bouncing elements of the gun making it almost impossible until he just jammed his finger into the slot and manhandled it into place, clicking the trigger over it. The hook for the firing lanyard seemed to fight back as he tried to get the hook over it, but eventually he triumphed, trailing the lanyard as he went to pop his head back up and out of the hatch. "I've got it! I've got an HE round loaded, and I got the lanyard," Fino shouted to Yule through the mic, and he looked back and forth between the two lines. From on top of the hill he saw nothing but the flashes of gun barrels and the inky smoke of burned powder, while down below elves were rushing up the steep hill. Fino could see the flash and booms of grenades being chucked by the advancing elves, and winced as one well-tossed grenade cooked off in the trees and tossed a few bodies forward out of the brush line, their bodies ripped and ragged as they made the short trip into the air. At the same time, the hilltop defenders were firing down at the paladin and the advancing elves, the rounds whizzing off the armor or splattering against hatch lids. "Right, turn right," Fino said, and gripped the lanyard in his hand. Below, he saw Yule's arms working the wheel from the open hatch, turning the paladin, and Fino squinted. It wasn't the best trying to sight down the barrel from above it, but it would be folly to try and use the aiming reticles with how Yule was driving. It was around the time of thinking that when Yule hit a low spot in the ground and then a high spot right after it, rattling Fino around in the hatch opening as if he were a loose carriage bolt on a wagon. Fino heard a loud cling in the shutter of metal, and after getting back to his vantage point, saw that the barrel clamp had come loose and slammed down onto the front plate of the paladin, allowing the barrel to swing freely. Fino went to throw his arms up into the air in celebration, as the barrel was now free of the clamp and free of damage, but regretted it almost within the same millisecond of thought. The report of the gun caused his teeth to rattle and the jellies of his eyes to vibrate. The massive barrel recoiled and spat out his payload, which landed right at the base of the hill by pure luck. The round exploded in a cloud of dust and shrapnel, turning bodies to pulps of meat and shreds of clothing in an instant. Working off of instinct, Fino then grabbed the M240 Bravo and began firing it, the weapon having survived rounds bouncing off of it, and shattered away randomly. Fino didn't really have the arm strength to really control the machine gun, and more guided it towards its targets than aimed it. The coin dropped for the elves, having believed it to be their own paladin, and they began to rout in earnest, throwing down their weapons and chest rigs in order to beat feet faster than with them on. Those in the wood line pushed forward, rifles and weapons still up and firing at those below, and within a few moments had retaken the top of the hill, as well as pushing forward over the crest and into the slope below. Yule aimed the paladin towards his platoons, while Fino guided the M240 Bravo over towards the elves, barking and rattling at them, currently in full flight away from the combat. Fino saw Yule's men jump into the artillery crater and pile the ruined bodies up like sandbags, even using them to rest their weapons on. At seeing this, Fino realized he was outclassed by multiple levels of soldiering, and quietly thanked the gods that he was put into artillery. From below, Fino realized that the stereo had gotten turned back on, and up from below came the boosted bass of... Now click the other link in the comments section. Fino couldn't help but shake his head in bewilderment as the M240 Bravo clunked to a halt, the belt dry. From below, Fino could even hear Yule singing along, roaring out above the sound of the Paladin's engine. She might have let you hold her hand at school, I'ma show you how to graduate. Fino was not sure what was more off-putting about the whole situation. Firing on his own race, the song selection on the tablet, or the fact that Yule knew the lyrics to this one by heart. The Paladin roared up the hill towards the Veil Riders at the top, the stereo still blasting random choices on whatever playlist it fell upon, and Yule jacked up his seat so his head could pop out of the hatch, smiling down upon the remnants of his surviving platoons. Staring back at him were the astonished faces of those who thought him dead, all of them suddenly cheering and yelling at those mopping up below. Fino kept his head low in the hatch ring, just the top of his head and the tips of his ears poking out as he looked out around him. As the Paladin came to a halt, the broken barrel rest clanging loudly against the armor, Yule killed the engine and took off his headset. "Well," a voice shouted, and Yule looked over to see the limping form of Mullen coming out of the woodline, smiling brightly and using a rough piece of branch as a cane. "Mullen!" Yule cried out happily, and hopped out the driver hatch after setting the parking brake, sliding down the front of the armor to land flat on his boot heels. "Yeah, you bunch of fuckers too, get over here." Yule gestured to the rest of his troopers and held out his arms. Dwarf, elf, brim-touched, and Oni all embraced Yule, some of them trying to hide tears as they were not only saved in the nick of time, but by the commander they thought to be dead. Yule rustled hair, pinched ears, or tugged on horns as he made his way to Mullen, who held out a hand that was missing part of his ring finger. Yule clasped Mullen's hand and pulled him in close for a hug as well, which he returned, patting Yule on the back a few times before pulling away. "Kept us waiting, did you?" Yule chuckled and turned, pointing at where Fino was hiding. "Well, I would have been even more tardy if it wasn't for a little turncoat. Let me introduce you to the sister who brought down the shells that killed us." And that's the end of part 1 of chapter 15. If you liked the story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbardia and click the bell icon so you know when the video is released through the week. Also, we aren't getting shit for these videos. So if you like the video a lot, by all means donate to the coffee and keep this ball rolling, because fuck me, YouTube does not like us very much. My word. And also, thanks to all of you who are listening and donating. You guys are keeping this fucking train running, and I appreciate you more than y'all can completely understand. But until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Guard Bro, and I'll see you in part 2.